Okay, let's begin. It's 5 o'clock straight up I got. We're going to be at this for exactly an hour. Okay, Tom?
Right.
60 minutes so we can go home and watch the wrong two teams in the national championship.
Hopefully, we talk for about 40 minutes, and then
Yeah.
you all fire questions
Yeah.
at Bill.
Yeah. Yeah. So my name is Bill Evertsberg. I'm one of the pastors here at Kenilworth Union Church. Thank you for being with us tonight. Obviously, if you don't know, you'll find out that this book is very relevant to the volunteer and employee management of an institution, either a corporate for-profit institution or for a university, for a congregation like this. So I'm looking around the room and seeing a bunch of board members from Kenilworth Union Church. Thank you for being here. Maybe Tom will tell us what we need to be thinking about in terms of corporate risk management as the board members of a local congregation. But Tom and Connie Cole have been good, faithful members of Kenilworth Union Church for a long time, our neighbors in the neighborhood, and my good friends to Kathy and me, my wife. Connie's sitting in the back row there. His daughter Emily is here. So welcome to you guys, and congratulations, Connie and Tom, on the recent birth of a new grandbaby.
Right.
Tell us her name, and tell us how many grandchildren you have.
This one's Louise. She's 8 days old, and we have 9 grandchildren, including 2 from Emily.
Great, congratulations
Thank
to
you.
you all. So, Tom, thank you for, Tom gave me a copy of his book. I read it last week. It's brilliant, it's helpful. And so tell us, Tom, how this book came about. It's the amount of research and work put into a volume like this is amazing. So tell us why you devoted all that energy to this book, why you wanted to share it with the public, and also tell us about the title, Collaborative
Sure.
Crisis Management.
Well, about 10 years ago, I spoke at a lawyer's seminar, PLI, for those of you who had to go through all that. And I spoke on crisis management, and to give continuing legal education credit, you have to submit something in writing. So I had this 3-4 page essay, and after that session, PLI, the people put on the seminar, called me up and said they wanted me to write a book. And I said, well, if I do it, I'd want it to go to a broader audience than just lawyers. And I also knew what their price points were. And so something around $90, I didn't think people would buy. I mean, precious few buy it at this rate. And I also said that I would want to collaborate with a communications expert on it, because that's a big piece of it. And Paul Verbinnen, who's my co-author, sorry about the clicking. Paul Verbinnen, my co-author, is a guy I had worked with, I collaborated with for mutual clients for decades. So I called him up. I said, someday we should write this book. And as I said, that was about 10 years ago. And then about 2 years ago, I said, someday has arrived. So why don't we do this? And we collaborated on it very much in the way we would collaborate in advising clients on crisis management.
So how does that work, a collaborative authorship? How do you put this together with your 2 different authorial voices,
Well,
obviously?
one of the things we said in the introduction is it's not going to be too hard to tell which one of us had the pen for which chapter, right? Because he did all the communications piece, and I did the rest of it. But we also read each other's pieces and commented on it. So it was a full collaboration, and it went well. Yeah.
So tell us about that collaborative nature of your title and your book, and
Yeah.
that's threaded through every page,
Right.
that it needs to be a team of various kinds of talented people to manage a crisis.
There are a variety of collaborations that have to occur. First of all, no crisis can be handled by a single discipline. God forbid you would hand it over to the lawyers, right? You also, I probably shouldn't say God forbid, but anyway. So it has to be multidisciplinary. That's the lawyers, it's the communications people, depending on the source of the crisis. It can very well be HR people. Certainly, if it really is a crisis, which is bordering on an existential issue for the enterprise, you need to have finance people involved, and so on and so on and so on. So you have this multidisciplinary group. The second collaboration is you will have people from inside the organization and people from outside the organization. So the insiders and the outsiders, and if they don't collaborate well, it's not going to go well. So you need to have that collaboration so that neither the insiders or the outsiders get too turf-oriented. It puts the greatest burden, frankly, on the outsiders to be highly diplomatic. And frankly, that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed working with my co-author, because he and I both try to take the position that we're not there on a turnkey basis, that we're not the sole source of good ideas. Another element of collaboration is, especially now in the era of corporate governance that we're in, you have to have a collaboration between the management and the board, because there's a great deal is expected of a board, both before a crisis, but during a crisis, and so on. And then finally, the collaboration really requires a strong leader. It's typically the CEO, and not always. Sometimes the CEO is the source of the crisis. #MeToo, right? But you have to have a leader who can do a number of things. One is think through the various collaborations, but also understand that not every point of view is going to carry the day. And so in order to keep the team together, the leader of the whole issue has got to be able to convince folks that just because their point of view didn't carry the day on that particular issue, they're still highly valued. Because otherwise, I mean, people get into, it's about, put it this way, it shouldn't be about winning and losing, it should be about getting to the right result. And that's a big item. And sometimes this requires the leader to adopt a different management style, a different leadership style during a crisis than the way they would normally do. Sometimes you have a leader who's much more of an autocrat, and that's not going to work well in terms of developing the collaboration. And sometimes you have a leader who's too much of a consensus builder and can't really get to a decision. That's probably not going to work well either. So it's a very dynamic situation. One last point. The leader needs to call balls and strikes. It's got to be making decisions. The leader has to be making decisions based on the merits, not because their closest friend in management or someone they are very concerned about on the board has a particular point of view. They've got to reach a conclusion based on the merits rather than based on loyalty or fear or whatever else might motivate them.
Okay, maybe I should back up here a minute, Tom, and you should tell the folk how you got involved in this kind of work. What were you doing when you met some of the people that you talk about in this book? Give us a abbreviated version of your CV.
Oh, I can't do that.
When did you encounter all these cases?
I'll start with the first crisis. Most of the crises I got involved in really are basically an onshoot, an outgrowth of an M&A practice and a takeover defense practice, as well as a shareholder activism practice. But the very first time a client ever called me and said, I want you to come in and help us manage a crisis, they actually had a crisis, had nothing to do with M&A. This was a company called Elger, it was a plumbing company. You've probably seen their brand. They had the misfortune of, they sold a lot of polybutylene pipe, which was used in building lots of houses and tracts of houses and the like, and had the misfortune, unfortunate characteristic of leaking, which is a bad attribute for pipe, right? And that's the first misfortune. The second misfortune was that their insurance company said, we're not covering this because leaking is not a sudden and accidental problem. That's the term in the insurance policy. So they lost at trial, and that was when I got a call from the board. I still remember it because you could hear the echo of the speakerphone. The board was in a board meeting. Somebody had just run in panting and saying, we just lost our insurance coverage. We are doomed. So they called me and said, we want you to be our crisis manager. I said, I don't think our firm's insurance policy responds to that, but I'll be a lawyer for you. And that was the first assignment. But it's just developed over time. It can be specific crises. It can be a #MeToo issue. It can be leaky pipe, or it can be shareholder activism.
Were you able to help them?
Yes. What I said was, okay, the first thing we have to do is keep the company alive long enough to win the appeal. And then we have to win the appeal. And so we kept the company alive long enough to win the appeal. And one of my partners, the late, great Howard Trenans, argued an insurance coverage case in the Seventh Circuit. And he could barely spell insurance, but he was a fabulous advocate. And I still remember one of his, you get a 3-judge panel in the Seventh Circuit, and you don't know who the 3 judges are until you walk in that day. But he studied up, and one of his judges was Richard Posner, who had wrote the Law and Economics book. And he asked Howard a question, and Howard's response was, "Now, Judge, I think you know the answer to that, because on page 47 of your treatise, you addressed that very point." It was unbelievable. And then when he got a question he couldn't really answer, he gave what we called the famous Trenan shrug. He just went like that. And he could get away with it with this panel. And I always wondered how the court reporter reported that.
Did you win the appeal?
Yeah.
And so Elger is solvent today?
Elger's alive and well, yeah.
So in your book, you talk about categories of crisis.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that. You just mentioned leaky pipes. In your book, there's another example about exploding airbags in cars.
Right.
Rather prominent corporate crisis.
Right.
What kinds of crises are there? You mentioned the Me Too crisis. So what is there?
I think it's useful to think in the categories. There's self-inflicted crises, and there are externally inflicted crises. There are crises that go to the core of the business. It actually has to do with what the company or organization or church or whatever is doing, and those that really are unrelated to the core. If you have a self-inflicted crisis, it is more likely to be thought of as a scandal, right? So a #MeToo is self-inflicted, leaky pipes is self-inflicted, having your office blow up in 9/11, that's not self-inflicted, right? And so there's a difference between being a victim and then having a scandal. So the great crisis that everybody studies in terms of management is the Tylenol crisis 40 years ago. Johnson & Johnson handled it beautifully. Things have changed dramatically since then, but they handled it beautifully. That was externally inflicted. It was not a scandal, and they did a great job. Now the environment is totally different than it was 40 years ago, but that's still used as a case study at the Department of Defense, of all places. You asked me how much research I did on this? Not that much. And it's not a memoir, but it is, just things I've learned about from having to deal with this stuff.
What did J&J do right? Let me ask you a two-part question, Tom, since you brought it up yourself. What did J&J do right 40 years ago, and how have things changed, and would they act the same way they did today? And what's changed, what's different in 40 years? Well,
J&J did everything right in terms of communication. At the time they did it, it was all about communication. And they admitted there was an issue. It was not of their own doing. And they started out with a great reputation. And then they were very transparent, and they pulled the product off the shelves. They didn't care what it was going to cost. They really conveyed a notion that they cared about people, right? That's what they did right. While things have changed, you want to do all those things, but as my co-author says, that's table stakes at this point. You've got to do much more, because the things that have changed is we're in a new era of corporate governance, so I suspect the CEO of J&J at the time, 40 years ago, kept his board relatively informed, but I'll bet they weren't crawling all over it like they might now, right? So it's different corporate governance. Now for a self-inflicted crisis, there's more likely to be a call for a management change and some activity on the part of shareholder activists. stay tuned to see what happens with Southwest Airlines.
Right.
Because people will talk about that.
Yeah. Well,
And look what happened with the CEO of Boeing, right?
yeah.
There's greater litigation risk because of digital communications. So people will be firing up. I suspect back then, because it was 40 years ago, people were not firing off, oh my God, emails or tweets or texts to each other. Now there will be that, and so you need to have a great deal of discipline in terms of creating documents that the plaintiffs bar or the regulators will go after. And again, evidence of that throughout some of the more current crises. So there's greater risk because of digital communications. Now, you also will see crises that envelop an entire industry, right? Opioids, right? I mean, the real crisis there was for the communities and the people who lost loved ones. But the different companies involved, the entire industry, starting with the pharmaceutical firms, then the distributors, then the retailers, like the drugstore chains. So when it envelops an entire industry or affects, say, business partners, you need to start thinking about, well, if we do this, how's that going to compare to what the other party did? And that comes up both in terms of speed of response, but it also comes up in terms of when you want to get into reputation rehabilitation, and we can talk about that later. But the number one change is communications, right? All I have to say is, internet and social media, right? It used to be, and talking to my co-author, who was a communications guy, you would think about the news cycle. Now there is no news cycle, right? And you would sometimes worry about putting out a press release on a Friday afternoon because you were thought of as hiding something. That's sort of relevant now. You still don't want to do it that way, but that's the biggest issue. And then I guess last is the potential for congressional inquiry. Not necessarily, I'm probably going to declare a bias here, not necessarily because they want to get to truth, but because they want to create a soundbite for the next election cycle.
Yeah. Well, your mention of J&J, which is an externally inflicted core crisis category, right?
Right.
Put that next to the Sackler and Pharma, which is an internally inflicted core crisis, right? So, I mean, Purdue Pharma could never look like the J&J people did 40 years ago, right?
No, but that's also an example of how a crisis can envelop or drag in a business partner. People read about and learned about and heard about the McKinsey involvement with Purdue, and so there is no hiding, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Almost an irredeemable crisis.
Pretty difficult. Yeah. We have a senior pharmaceutical person in the audience. Hi, Honest. But one of the good guys.
Okay, good.
You're welcome.
So the subtitle of your book, Tom, is Prepare,
Right.
Execute, Recover, and Repeat. Hit us some high points of those.
Okay, well, prepare is really risk management. That's what you do, thinking that there might be a crisis someday. And one of the key elements of risk management is to sit back and reach a conclusion. The lawyers in the room will understand. Reach a business judgment about what your mission-critical crises and compliance obligations are. So you need to think about, based on what your business is, what's mission-critical. If you're in the food business, like my daughter, you're really focused on food safety, right? One of the key decisions about that in the Delaware courts, holding a board liable, involved ice cream, right? Okay, so so you think about, given our business, what's mission critical. For if you build airplanes, safety is mission critical. And so you want to actually do a deep dive into that, really understand it, and bring that to the board level, and make it visibly at the board level, right? Don't just rely on the fact that, yeah, we talked about that now and then. If you were building airplanes, you would probably say we should have a board level committee on that, on safety, and that sort of safety and engineering. Boeing put that in afterward, after the 737 MAX issues, particularly when they read what the Delaware court said about the absence of that, right? It was a little bit of closing the barn door, but better late than never, I suppose. So if you were in an organization that was involved in dealing with youth or minors, like a church is, or like universities are, and whatnot, you give a good deal of thought to, it's really mission critical to us that we don't have concerns like what has happened with the Boy Scouts, with the Catholic Church, at Penn State, that sort of thing. So you sit back, and as part of risk management, you first reach a conclusion, what's really mission critical. Then there's a lot of traditional risk management stuff. I mean, back when I first started practicing law a long time ago, when Cam's father was the head of my law firm, if you asked to meet with the risk management people, it was the people who bought insurance, period, full stop, rather than people who really sat down and thought about compliance risk and other risk. Yeah.
So, I feel sorry for you because there are no current examples of crises in corporations, right?
Yeah.
It just feels...
I've been terribly bored.
It just feels ubiquitous, Tom.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about Southwest and the city of Buffalo with its snow management.
Right.
And Purdue Pharma, and you mentioned Penn State, and Michigan State, and Michigan, and the University of Southern California,
Right.
and the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
I mean, what's going on? Is it worse than it used to be, or do we just know more about what's going on?
It may be more the latter. Who knows? I mean, like I said, I didn't do a lot of research on this. But when you bring up Buffalo and Southwest Airlines, Buffalo is interesting because one of the things you ask yourself in risk management is, do we prepare for a black swan event? I mean, Buffalo, the snowstorm in Buffalo was a black swan. It was what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the unknown, unknowable, or whatever. Everybody used to laugh at that, but it was actually pretty savvy what he said. But it was a black swan. So the question is, do you prepare for a black swan event? The answer is no. You should really be preparing for the highest probability risk, and hope that the steps you take in preparing for that will be useful in the event there is a black swan. And Buffalo is also interesting because there is a whole other body of research and their books. There's actually a book called Collaborative Crisis Management, but it is focused at government entities. And one of the reasons they talk about the need for collaboration in disaster management, which is what that book is, the other book for the same title is about, is because you will have different agencies fighting with each other. And if you saw some of the press conferences between the city and the county in dealing with Buffalo, they were not collaborating. They were going like that, right? They could be faulted for not doing a better job in risk management for a more typical kind of snowstorm. Having a better system of telling people you really do have to stay in, or when you hear this big storm is coming, before it actually hits, do all these things. So that's one thing. On Southwest Airlines, one of the problems with Southwest Airlines is that none of the other airlines seem to have the problem, right? And what the history of that and this case study hasn't yet been written, but it seems as though they were skimping on their technology, that the other airlines had done a better job of investing in technology, and it was a failure of that. And that can, saving money and cutting costs are typically good things, but that can create a risk and create a crisis ultimately. One situation I was hired to help with was a toy company, right? A toy company that had, like all good toys, all of its product was manufactured in China, right? And they were squeezing their suppliers so hard that the suppliers had to cut back on their costs. And unfortunately, the suppliers found out that lead-based paint is cheaper. So, you don't need me to elaborate on that. But one of the points I've told boards is, if you're really gonna squeeze a supplier, maybe you need to take up your quality control and quality assurance, and do more than just rely on what the supplier says. Actually, do your own sampling at their factories, because for every action there's a reaction, and when you squeeze a supplier and they start cutting corners, it will ultimately redound to your detriment, because it's your product and you're the interface with the customer and consumer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm still in the prepare stage. All I know about these factors is what I read in the newspaper. I'm in a different business from air travel or cryptocurrency, for instance.
Right.
But you talk about keeping yourself in a position to where when something unexpected happens, you've got a culture and the human resources to deal with it.
And reputation.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I know about Southwest Airlines and FTX as a crypto bank, they spent a lot of their time burnishing their reputation and making sure they were platformed to deal with unusual events, both of them.
Yeah.
What happened and what kind of culture puts us in a position to where we're best equipped to deal with
Yeah, and
a
this
snowstorm in Buffalo?
Right. Well, this also gets to leadership. I think of culture, and we devote a chapter to it. A culture is a risk management element. If you have a culture where people are afraid to come forward and tell the emperor he's naked or she's naked, then you've got a problem. If you've got a culture where somebody coming forward with bad news gets punished, nothing good is going to come from that. So you need to have a leader who says, it's the old Godfather rule, bad news has to come fastest. You can take your time telling me about good things, but when something really bad is happening, you can add to that culture with a very effective whistleblower program.
Yes, right.
And that can be important. But this is one of those interfaces between the management and the board. A good board, typically in an audit committee, will get a report on all whistleblower complaints.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for the Kremlin?
Yeah, get a new CEO.
Well, I mean, right. I mean, a perfect negative example of what you're talking about.
No, that's right.
You
I mean,
can't tell Vladimir Putin what's wrong.
Right, and yeah, you can't.
Right.
Or you might find yourself falling out of a window, which apparently has been happening. Yeah.
So you need to protect your whistleblowers. A CEO needs to have an ego strong enough to hear what's wrong and how to deal with it.
As a matter of fact, there was an example. You need to protect the whistleblowers, and you need to protect the CEO, because the CEO will hear, somebody has said this. Well, who did it? Who said it? Well, it was an anonymous whistleblower into the hotline. Well, let's find out who did it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
The Barclays Bank CEO tried that, and it didn't work out well for him. Right? I mean, and I've had CEOs say, well, these are our phones. Why don't we just find out who's making those calls? I said, you really don't want to deal with that. You don't want to deal with that. But culture is a big element of risk management.
What do you tell your clients before the crisis comes? to start working, to start honing and sharpening a culture that will stop.
Yeah, and that's sometimes, you know, you got to have a really good relationship with the CEO to tell them that, you know, you're being kind of a pig about this, and you need to,
Yep.
you know, that's part of the diplomacy part. You struggle for the words, but the culture really should be emphasized a great deal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
By the way, one other element of the Southwest is the apology, right? You've got to give a forthright apology, and it can't sound like something the lawyers wrote for you, right? As my co-author writes in his sections of the book, it's got to be an apology that your grandmother would accept and not blush about. And the other element of apologies is it's got to be very well crafted, and that is not a time to ad lib, right? The worst apology ever given was from the BP CEO,
yes.
right?
talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was really a beautiful apology, and then he went on and said, and you know, I'd like to get my life back too. Well, you know, tell that, yeah, I think he was gone, I have a timeline on this, I think he was gone within a month, right? It did not play well. There was another ad lib that it wasn't quite as devastating, but the CEO of Goldman Sachs said something about doing God's work, and people somehow thought that didn't really align with Goldman Sachs.
So apology is important.
Apology is important, and it's got to be
Even
full-throated.
Even though the lawyers might tell the CEO not to apologize because that will lead to greater liability.
Right. Yeah, it's not, in the old days, before you had a collaboration between a lawyer and a communications person, people used to summarize it by saying the lawyer said shut up, and the communications people said, you know, full kimono, open kimono. But it's probably not going to add to the liability ultimately. Hopefully that will be done on the facts. You know, you can maybe work around the words a little bit, but an apology will go a long way.
Were you impressed by Southwest's verbal response to the crisis?
So far, more impressed by the words than the actions. But I think the actions remain to occur. I mean, there was one piece in the paper, and I haven't studied this in detail. So, but one of the things they did was they were going to give everybody 25,000 airline miles.
Yeah.
I thought, be sure when you say that we're, and that's just the beginning. You know, that's just the down payment, because that will be just a down payment.
Yeah. It feels.
What's really interesting. If you look at the Southwest stock price, it's recovered to where it was before all this happened.
Is that common? That the shelf life of a crisis is minuscule?
Oh no, some crises have a decade-long shelf life, because you go through, and this is where we get to the phases. You have the hair on fire phase, where everybody's going, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Then you get to the grinded out phase, and then you get to the long game, which unfortunately is probably the litigation phase. But we have some examples in the book of from the beginning of the crisis, like airbags, to the end of it, the end of the litigation is over a decade.
That's one of the things I love most about your book. It's rich in case study. It's not a case study book.
We didn't want to do a case study book, yeah.
Yeah, well, you talk about Purdue and Takata and
Yeah.
Volkswagen. Yeah, and the density of those concrete examples gives your book a real vividness in life.
Well, thanks.
So let me go there for now. What are the special issues in crisis management related to Kenilworth Union Church and the University of Michigan and Michigan State University? What's peculiar about that arena? What should King Poor and Jim be worried about?
I think I sort of alluded to this before, any organization that deals with minors, you have to be very careful about that and very diligent in knowing what's going on. Because the examples and the dollar signs associated with improper conduct are very significant. But it's not just the dollar signs, it's reputation, And this is where, we're a bit odd in our book in the sense that we talk about reputation management as being an element of risk management. A good friend who's now the Chancellor of Vanderbilt wrote a book on reputation management, Daniel Diermeyer. But I think it's a big item because if you have a generally good reputation, you just might catch a break, right? And if you're known for trying to do things the right way, and you got struck by lightning, even a self-imposed kind of crisis, you may catch a bigger break. So I think that's an element. Another, and in some ways it's related to reputation management, but for universities in particular, you have to be very careful about what we call the tainted donor, right? Look at all the buildings that have Sackler on them, or used to, anyway. And part of this it's a tricky thing when you're going out and asking somebody for a bunch of money, particularly with the naming right. Do you do a background check on them? Yeah, you should. Why not, right? And then when you're negotiating these big donor agreements, are very heavily negotiated at times. And one of the questions is, what happens if after the name has gone up on the building, you find out that they were a scoundrel? Or they become a scoundrel after you put the name on the building? Can you take the name down without giving the money back? That sort of thing. It's tricky. But I think tainted donor, especially because I think some people are wanting to make the contribution and getting the name on the building to rehabilitate their own reputation. So you have to be careful.
Yeah. Do you think it was fair for the American public to chastise MIT for accepting money from Jeffrey Epstein, for instance?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah. There are a couple of examples of that. Jeffrey Epstein, not just MIT, but Harvard. Emily went to, sorry about this. Emily went to the wrong law school, but so as a result of that, I get to see the Harvard magazine. And they devoted an entire page to explaining why it was they took his money after things happened.
So that was a slip up for those
Yeah.
development offices at
Yeah.
MIT and Harvard.
Yeah, yeah. University of Cincinnati named a baseball field or a stadium for Margie
yes.
Schott,
Yeah,
right? After she was identified as being a Hitler aficionado. Yeah.
So how do Christian values help leaders prepare for and manage crisis?
I think of Christian values as including caring for others, right? And frankly, it's not limited to Christian values. Just about every faith tradition feels that way. But a word from our sponsor.
Yeah.
If you're fundamentally concerned about caring for others, then your risk management will be focused on making sure that people are not hurt by your product, that your employees are not hurt for producing the product, right? And so on and so forth. And when a crisis does occur, then I think Christian values cause you to say, to own up to your responsibility and
Yes.
try to make things right.
Yeah, well
right?
said.
Right. And so
Right.
I think it's Christian values. It's Old Testament values. It's Asian faiths, all kinds of faiths.
Yeah, right. So if you're in charge of a business like that, you try to make sure that your pipes don't leak to wreck your customer stuff,
Right.
that your airbags don't explode upon impact and kill your travelers, that kind of thing. And also, if it does happen, that you take care of the injured,
Right.
right? That seems like a fundamental Christian value. First, do no harm,
Right.
Hippocratic oath, but if harm happens, make good on it.
And
Stand behind it.
sometimes what that requires as part of risk management is to make sure that you're going to have the financial wherewithal to do it. So, have the right kind of insurance, right? because you may not be able to do it without their help. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
What else do you want to tell this group, Tom, before I turn it over to them?
The one thing I would say, something that is underemphasized, I think, in risk management, in crisis management, is the HR piece. You need to, in two different ways. One, again, my co-author has this notion of concentric circles for communication. He said, and this may sound odd coming from basically a PR guy. He said, your most important audience for all your communication is internal. It's not the press. It's not even the government. It's your own employees, because they're going to be concerned about their reputations. They're on the line, right? I mean, so imagine if you were working the counter at Southwest.
Oh, man.
Yeah, kind of rough, right? But it's not just that. But it's not just the customers who are coming to you. It's your family who says, "Boy, you must really be embarrassed by what's happening at your company." So you need to focus on the communication to your own people as part of HR. The other thing is that whenever there is a crisis, and almost whenever there's a crisis, you have individuals who are in crisis, right? They may be responsible for the crisis, or they may feel they're responsible, or they fear what's going to happen to them, and they're going to, they're worried about layoffs and the like. So, focusing on the HR aspect of a crisis, I think is often underemphasized.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to questions from the crowd, but Tom donated a pile of books to Kenilworth Union Church. So if you would like a copy of the book, give us your money, and that comes to us. Thank you, Tom, for that gift.
Right. We wanted to put the offering plate next to it. And if we run out, it's also available on Amazon.
And this session is being streamed. We may have some remote participants to this class, so Christine will follow around with a microphone if you have a question for Tom.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming out. I thought it was entirely possible. I mean, our egos can handle speaking to an empty room, but it's less fun. We rescheduled. That's true. Yes, sports fans.
And you've been here before, Tom. We did this with a book before of yours. Remind me of the title of that book. Good Governance or something.
CEO Leadership, Navigating the New Era of Corporate Governance.
Yeah.
Also available on Amazon. My royalty income from these books is not yet approximating minimum wage.
Tom, is it more fun to be advising a client in a crisis or in an M&A transaction?
You're going to think I have a perverse notion of fun. Probably in a crisis. Yeah. Especially if you feel like you can actually help them. Now, you're helping people in an M&A transaction too. But sometimes the two blend when you're talking about takeover defense, where the company should not be sold, either because it's the wrong time or somebody's trying to acquire it too cheaply. What do you think, John? Yeah.
Okay, and then you have to go next.
Tom, you're so experienced in dealing with crisis, but can you tell a story about maybe a crisis that involved the board? Maybe the board didn't function properly?
Huh. Well, the granddaddy is the TransUnion case, 1985, which was the beginning of all corporate law, if you really think about it, where the board simply did what the CEO told them to do, without giving any thought. I mean, a board that does not do its job in a very thorough way and frankly in a visible way, in a well-recorded way, is going to put itself into crisis. Yeah. I had a #MeToo situation with the non-executive chairman of a board who was hitting on the CEO's secretary. Now, if you know corporate law, the board cannot remove one of its members. Only the, only the shareholders can remove a director. And in some instances, it can only be for cause. Well, here we had cause. So what we had to do there was make sure this fellow would understand that he had to quit. And not only quit, but apologize, which he did. That was a bit of an odd one.
Hi.
It's on.
How would you characterize Elon Musk at Tesla? A crisis in character, a crisis in company?
Keep going.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, or just riff on that.
It's really interesting. I think controlled companies and sometimes family-controlled companies can be the most difficult because they have majority ownership, and if they either actually have majority economic ownership or do it through a dual-class voting system, they have majority vote. Musk's securities trial is coming up soon, quite soon, in California. Well, he's trying to move it. You saw that. Yeah. We're not going to comment on Texas. No, he's a problem in part because he's got total control, right? What's really interesting is companies where a founder or a CEO has voting control and has total control over the board. It's very difficult to see how the board can be completely independent about that. But the courts have been pretty benign in thinking that, well, Martha Stewart, right? Martha Stewart had voting control, and the thought was she still had an independent board, and they could decide whether or not to bring a fiduciary duty claim against her, which I find really interesting, because the opinion goes only dealt with the fact that people were saying, well, they were social friends, they did this, they did that, and they noted that she could eliminate any of the board members vote them off. We're not talking about Putin again. That she could vote them off, but they were unmoved by that.
I just want to thank you. First of all, I'm not on a board. I'm not with a corporation, but I have a business. So just listening tonight for your preparation,
Yeah.
I'm in real estate. So it was very helpful. And I will remember the steps that you itemized on, just making sure that I handle each transaction
Right.
in the right way. So I think you can relate it not only to a board,
Yeah.
but also any type of individual business that you have as well. So
Yeah,
thank you.
One of our concerns, thank you. One of our concerns about the book was that people would say, I'll buy that book and I'll read it when we have a crisis. This should not be behind glass, break when you have a crisis. People should read, if nothing else, they should read part 1 in advance, which is all the risk management stuff. Yeah.
I'll come back to you. Hold on 1 second.
Thank you. Elon Musk was brought up in Twitter, and a lot of time was dedicated to internally created crises. How do you differentiate how you would approach an externally created crisis using kind of the Twitter example where, billions of dollars of market cap was eroded when they had that validation tag for Twitter, and so you're reacting to something that's completely unforeseeable. Are there any recommendations on how you approach external created crises?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, an externally created crisis can be better for the company's reputation. I'm not sure the checkmark tab, that didn't feel real externally created. The ultimate externally created crisis I mentioned before was 9/11, which is something where I didn't have the luxury of advising others on. I was the head of the firm at the time, and it was, that was pretty difficult. But intuitively for that, and I'll get back to your question in a minute, but intuitively for that, our focus on communications was almost entirely internal. You know, we let our clients know that we were still able to operate, but we spent all of our time talking to our own people because they just wondered what was going to happen. They literally wondered whether the payroll was going to be addressed. You know, I mean, those were tough times. I don't know. Externally created crises, especially if you've got a decent reputation, you're more likely to get a break. You know, I mean, Tylenol, J&J was a victim. You always want to be on the victim side rather than the cause side. You know, that's all I can say.
And the pandemic too, right? I mean,
yeah, the pandemic was very interesting. I mean, we devoted a chapter at the end because,
Yeah.
you know, when we wrote it, why not, right? The way different companies handled the pandemic was pretty interesting. Starting with vaccine requirements, right? I worked with one company that was a food manufacturer, and they could not impose vaccine requirements in the current employment market because they said a lot of their stuff was produced in Texas. We're back to Texas. A lot of their stuff was produced in Texas, and if they mandated vaccines, they would lose 40% of their workforce. The other example, which is amazing, is the way United Airlines handled, and they're a client, but so I'll brag about it. The way they handled the vaccine mandate, they got everybody on board, and they did it very patiently. It took a long time. They went through the unions, but it was quite remarkable. You know, in part, they learned a bit about handling crises with the Dr. Dow issue, which, you know, when the guy was dragged off the plane, he wasn't dragged off by United people. It wasn't even a United Airlines plane. It was, it was one of the regional carriers. But they learned a lot about crisis management from that example.
did they use it for future crises, including vaccinations?
I was not involved in that, and I wouldn't be at liberty to talk about it, but I will tell you that one of the very senior people told me they learned a great deal from Dr. Dow, which gets to the other parts of so prepare and execute.
Yeah.
We talk about recover and repeat. The recover part is understanding the cause of the crisis, really fully understanding the cause of the crisis, and reputation management is part of recovery. This is where you'd say, should we give 25,000 miles, or should we do more? Or if you're in the opioid crisis, do what if anything do we do beyond what the attorneys general ask us for? If you were an electric utility and you have a problem, do you provide charitable gifts and civic sort of engagement in the areas where you had the blackouts? That's reputation management. The repeat part is, what did we learn from dealing with the last crisis? What are the lessons learned that we can apply to the next one? And people need to think about being prepared and then dealing with the crisis, but then also after the crisis, what do we do? And that's sometimes, especially when you get to a root cause analysis, that's where the lawyers start twitching, because you're doing this deep dive on what did we do wrong, and you're probably creating a roadmap a bit for the plaintiff's bar.
Yeah. Yeah.
But ultimately, you need to figure that out.
I want to pick up on a comment that Bill made about whether or not crises are more common, and I think the Southwest situation is a good example. We live in a world of much greater complexity and in a world of much higher standards, expectations for outfits that service, and the airline industry is really a good example. That business has become so much more complicated to run than it was even 10 years ago. And our expectations for what we want out of the airline business, and as well as shareholders and employees. Number one, I'd be interested in your thoughts. And number two, I wonder if it says something about how we need to rethink the risk management function in companies, in being able to anticipate this stuff. Thank you.
Well, Southwest, first of all, I tend to agree. I mean, things are much more complex. Part of the complexity is the globalization of the economies, right? Whoever heard about supply chain management, right? We all know about supply chain management, or at least we can utter the words, right? But supply chain management is, you know, if you were, people didn't used to give a lot of thought to the fact of where all this stuff was coming from and how to deal with it. But now you know, a supply chain manager is a pretty important person in a company. I think part of the issue of risk management comes from the pressure on companies to create profits. And so, as I was alluding to earlier, you need to think through when you're squeezing costs out, whether that's going to trigger a new kind of risk. Like, you know, my toy company in lead-based paint is a great example, but I think Southwest is an example as well. And people don't have, you know, everything's just-in-time inventory, right? Again, a new phrase we all learned in the past decade. You know, that works great when things are working, and not so hot when they're not. Yeah.
Sorry, just a question around when you say, you know, repeat or whatever, as we go through and you want, we do the deep dive to figure out what we've learned.
Right.
How do you keep that and actually utilize it for the next time? Because hopefully it's not something that happens, you know, a year from now or 2 years from now. Hopefully it's a while, but oftentimes then your management has changed. Maybe your lawyers have changed. Maybe your board has changed. And so the company as a whole or the organization as a whole has gone through it, but maybe some of the leaders at the time haven't.
Yeah.
So how do we keep those lessons and actually utilize them so that as the new folks coming in or whatever, we can actually take those learnings and utilize them?
Yeah, institutional memory is what you're talking about, and it's very, very important. And in a typical public company, you will have board members of much longer tenure than the CEO, because and you know, there's a lot of pressure on refreshing a board, and I support that. I think it's a great idea, but do it sequentially, you know, serially. Don't clean house all at once, because it's very good. You know, there are folks who say that there's actually a study that says if you've been on a board for 8.9 years, not 9, not 8.8, but 8.9 years, if you've been on a board that long, you're going to lose your independence. I think it depends on the individual. I've seen board members who've been on a board for 20 years who are the most independent people there. I've seen others who stayed on for 20 years because they did whatever the CEO asked. You know, so it really depends on the individuals. But if you have people who've been on long enough and who can get you from one crisis to hopefully, you know, there won't be another one, but there will be, right? You know, that can be very helpful. And, you know, some continuity in advisors. It sounds like an advertisement, but I've just retired, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, kickoff's not for half an hour.
Regarding board of directors, I've noticed through working with nonprofits over the years that there are so many times when someone's on the board of directors in name only. And I wonder what you have to say about that, because there was one situation that I witnessed where there were a lot of in name only board members, and things went very, very wrong. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
This is actually a pet peeve. Connie's saying, oh, go for it, Tom. I think it's a terrible mistake for institutions, not-for-profits in particular. First of all, they tend to have very large boards. And so you run into the social loafing risk. You know, I don't have to do something because somebody else will do it. And if everybody has the same point of view, nobody does it, right? I think it's also a mistake to put somebody on a board with an understanding that we really want your name and, oh, by the way, your dollars, but you don't have to come to meetings. I think that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake for the individual because, they're not really contributing in the way they should. Sure, it should be a principal philanthropy for them, but that's just a starting point. They should really be there. Now, very often you will have a CEO of a not-for-profit, present company excluded, who is very happy with the in name only because they don't really want a board. But that's a mistake for them too.
But it's so common
Oh, I know.
in nonprofits.
Yeah. Well, and it's very much a function of the size of not-for-profit boards. Look, I'm on the University of Chicago board. I've been there for 21 years. Nobody is going to accuse me of a name only or a checkbook only because I don't have that kind of checkbook. It's a problem sitting on a board with billionaires, right? But I'm getting over it. No, but you need to focus on take an important role. Now, one of the solutions to that is with a very large board, you have a very active executive committee, right? And in many ways, that's the real board. But that's too bad too. Okay.
I was going to ask you about what you might describe as a slow burn crisis, a hidden crisis. And what brought it to mind was the Chicago Tribune did a series of articles this past fall about 3M and its production of what are called forever chemicals. These are chemicals that get into the aquifer, and they've got plants on the Mississippi and all throughout up in Minnesota. And for 20 years, this has been a simmering problem. And there have been lawsuits, and it was always, and community groups were raising questions about this and the effect on public health. And just nothing really dramatic happened, it seems. And then a week or two before Christmas, the headline of the Tribune is 3M changes policy on forever chemicals. They've announced that they're not going to produce them anymore. So what are your thoughts about a board that sort of tolerates this kind of thing and is only prompted once the publicity hits? There wasn't really a crisis that prompted them to do that for all these years, and then all of a sudden it's the publicity that prompts this. And what is sort of what do you as a board member need to do in terms of avoiding the lurking? It does not help their reputation to have this on the front page of the Tribune week after week, and then finally it's like, well, I guess they changed their mind now. But what are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is, even though I'm retired, 3M is a client of my firm.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not going to answer.
All right. Okay.
But let me work around.
Had I known that, I wouldn't have asked the question.
Okay. The book's going to cost you twice.
Okay.
But, see, okay. Very often, there are instances where a board first learns about a risk when it gets publicized like that, right? Boards should pay more attention to the public disclosure they make under the risk factors sections of their 10K than they sometimes do. I remember when risk management first talked about, a lot, like 15 years ago, and the CEO of a company he's on the University of Chicago board with me, said, I don't really fully understand all the risks of this other company where I sit on the board. And I said, well, let me give you a hint. Why don't you go back and read the risk factors section of the 10K you just signed? And he said, fair point. But there is a lot of disclosure, and people work over it very carefully. And sometimes the board members don't totally focus on it. Now, if you have a really well-operating audit committee, they're highly focused on risk. And they sit back and they go through the exercise I talked about before. What's our mission-critical risk? What's our mission-critical compliance requirement? then we'll think about it. You know, these forever chemicals, it's not just 3M. I mean, DuPont had the issue. DuPont's also a client, but there's a movie about it. I think Black River, is that it? Yeah. So, see the movie.
The board has got to have their antenna out for, but, you know.
It's part of their job.
Yeah, looming crises.
Yeah, it's part of their job. What's our risk? Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's more attention being given to it because there's greater expectation on the part of boards. It goes back to a decision, I forget what year it was, the Caremark decision, where boards were first found to be liable for not having appropriate oversight, right? And then the Caremark decision's been, you know, tacked onto. But it basically, the judge who wrote it was sort of the leading corporate jurist, William Allen, who's since passed away. 80s, 90s, yeah. It's cited in the book. But I go through the entire litany of the Caremark decisions and its progeny. But basically, Chancellor Allen said that a board is obligated to make sure it's got a system for reporting this kind of thing. And once it's got the system, it better follow through on it, which was the next case. Which was a change, because before that, it was a change in the law. The Alice Chalmers case said, yeah, you know, and until something really bad happens, you know, the board doesn't have to pay attention to it. Oh, Enron. No, we'll not make it to kickoff.
Yeah, well, so I got about a few minutes after 6. All of our questions have not been asked and answered, but I'll let some of you go, and I bet Tom will stick around here and answer some of your questions if you'd like to come up and talk. Thank you for coming, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.